Hello, everybody. Good morning, dear OLLI members as well. Let me welcome you to the class of Fall for the Book, The Art of Living in an Impermanent World. Please mute your microphones, and if you have any kind of questions, you can type it into the chat. And now let me hand over to Kate Lewis from Fall for the Book.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Fall for the Book, The Art of Living in an Impermanent World with Tashi Slater. We're thrilled to have you all here as part of our year-round lineup. We have another virtual event in the summer, so please check out our full schedule on our website, fallforthebook.org. We'll be taking audience questions at the end of the event, so if you could put those in the chat, we'd appreciate it. Please keep your microphones muted for the duration of this event. A link will appear in the chat to purchase Anne's book from McKay's Books. So we hope you'll click on that and get her book. Thank you also to our partners, OLLI Mason. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our author, Tashi Slater, and our moderator, Dr. Amy Weinstein. Amy is an associate instructional professor in the Honors College at George Mason University, where she focuses on teaching classes in research and inquiry. In addition, her teaching experience includes research classes on communication and community and creative nonfiction. Her doctorate is in higher education rhetoric. Prior to working at George Mason, Amy spent a decade in Tokyo teaching writing for Temple University's Japan campus. And our author, Tashi Slater's fiction, essays, and interviews have been published by The New Yorker, the Paris Review, and the New York Times, among many others. She's a contributing editor at Tricycle, where she hosts an interview series related to impermanence. Guests have included George Saunders, Ann Patchett, David Sedaris, and Laurie Moore. Her work also appears in many anthologies, including the Penguin Book of Modern Tibetan Essays, Wanting, Women Writing About Desire, Women in Clothes, and American Dragons, and the Best American Essays, and speaks and teaches workshops around the world. And she's a longtime resident of Tokyo, where she actually met Amy in a book club. It is my great pleasure to introduce both author and moderator to Fall for the Book. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Kate.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see everyone here. And let's jump right in.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Kate. Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, Amy.
The book is so delightful and lovely. I hope that everyone can get it. Can you start us off with a good definition of Bardo, where it comes from, how we might apply it to our current lives?
Sure. So Bardo, of course, as you all know, the title of my book is Traveling in Bardo. And Bardo is a Tibetan Buddhist idea and is especially present in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it means between state, right? The word Bardo. And in Tibetan belief, it can be the period between death and rebirth. So after a person dies and as they travel through this, intermediate state to rebirth, it also can be between birth and death, which is where we all are now, all of us here together on this call. And then also it refers to periods of when our ordinary reality is suspended. And so it could be when you're ill or when you have an accident or you move to a new place or any time like that. And so how we might apply it to our lives. There are many different ways, but basically, so these intermediate states or between states of Bardo are periods of transition, right? It's some kind of transition and it's uncertainty. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I use as a kind of frame, like a loose frame for my book, is considered a kind of guidebook, if you will, to navigating Bardo. And so it helps us to navigate from birth to death as we go through the periods of transition and uncertainty that we inevitably encounter in life. And the idea is that if we take to heart, some of the principles that are talked about, that we can actually go through these periods more easily, and we can find greater meaning, we can find greater happiness.
And that's so important in our lives because,
Yeah.
as we talk about extensively, nothing is permanent. Everything is sort of in between.
Exactly. And what's funny is that we strive for the opposite, right? Because we don't want things to change, right? And
Right,
even though, everything, like all evidence to the contrary, because the fundamental, really, the only thing that we can be sure of, and this is what we can learn from the Bardo, concepts as well, is change.
right,
It's the only certainty.
right. And how do we, can you say a little bit more about maybe an in-between state, your children growing up and how we might use some of these concepts, or your children growing up, or the death of a parent or things like that? Because I know this has been
Yeah.
for you.
Those are really good examples of between states. And so we're always, whether we realize it or not, or whether we pay attention to it or not, we're always going through transitions. And so it could be, as you said, like the death of a parent. It could be when our children leave home, empty nest, when we have the empty nest. Maybe we move to a new city. It's not always, I think sometimes people think it's like bad things, but it's not like good or bad, but it can be like really challenging, like, losing someone we love, losing a job, being between jobs. It can also be something really joyful, like having a child, right? But that throws us into a new reality. And so we're in this period between the life that we knew that now is finished, like before we had children, and now navigating, as we enter this new reality that we're in. And so we really experience betweenness in all sorts of ways. And so we have like the betweenness, between birth and death. And then within that, we have all these other, betweens that we inevitably, as I said, experience in life.
Right, right. One of my personal favorite parts of the book is when you tell the story of your grandfather being caught in an avalanche and pressing through. Can you tell us that a little bit about that story and all of that?
Sure. Yeah, this is so just to explain a little bit about my connection to Tibetan Buddhism and to the Tibetan Book of the Dead is my mother is Tibetan from Darjeeling. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is actually an 8th century text that was only came to the West, and it was published in 1927 by Oxford University Press. And my great grandfather, my Tibetan great grandfather, helped to make that possible by introducing the editor of the Tibetan Book of the Dead to the translator, and so and helping it come to the West for the first time. So my great grandfather, who did that, was traveling one day. He was a very close friend of the 13th Dalai Lama, and he worked with him. And he was coming down one day in 1912 from Tibet to back to down to his home in Darjeeling in India. And he got caught in an avalanche. And he and his pony were buried along with a lot of the other men and their pack animals. And my great grandfather was a very devout Buddhist, and he was an orphan who was raised in for a while. He was in a monastery. He was like a apprentice lama or monk, so he was very familiar with the Buddhist teachings, including the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And the author of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is somebody named Padmasambhava, or Guru Rinpoche, who was a 8th century saint, right, who came from India to Tibet. And my great grandfather, when he was buried under the snow, he started praying. He prayed every day, and he always had his prayer beads with him, and he was praying, counting his prayer beads, and he's saying, save me, Guru Rinpoche, save me. And as he was doing this, he managed to, work his hand up through the snow and to wave his hand back and forth with the prayer beads. And the men above ground saw him, and he was saved.
Wow. That's a crazy story. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and it sort of illustrates, as we've talked about in the past, you and I, about how you accept reality, but hope for the best.
Yeah, and the one reason I really love this story is that it really illustrates because it's so, my great-grandfather was such he was so much a believer in the teachings and in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and one of the central, or maybe the central idea in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is to accept reality but not give up. And
Mhm.
so we tend to struggle or fight against reality. We fall into denial if we're ill, or in this case, in an accident. Um, and he could have, if he had done that instead of accepting reality, he could have been like thinking, oh, I wish I was still riding my pony along on a beautiful morning in the Himalayas, or, why did this happen to me? Why me? Why not somebody else? And all the things that we think of when we don't want to accept the reality of our situation. And
Mhm.
so, if he had done that, he would have died because, he would have perished because you have an extremely small, amount of time before you suffocate when you're buried in an avalanche. I don't know, it's like 10 or 15 minutes, whatever it is. And because he faced the truth of his situation, he was able to take action, right? And to put his arm up through the snow rather than sitting there thinking, well, this isn't that bad, or, probably somebody will find me, or all the different things that we think. And so metaphorically, I think it's such a great story as well, because it speaks to how we can also do that. Like if we face the truth of our situation, whatever it may be, then we can take some kind of action that will improve our situation for us.
We don't, we have to radically accept what is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so it's certainly, and it's very much related to this idea again of taking action, which I didn't understand that well when I first started, researching my book and studying the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is that I thought action means, like, I don't know, some like big thing, right? You're
Take
gonna like,
action.
right, that's
Yeah.
right, right, start a revolution, move to a new country, whatever it might be. But in the Buddhist way of looking at things, action means body, speech, mind, right?
Okay.
So it could be body, which in the case of my great grandfather, it was a physical action, right, that he took, right, of putting his arm up through the snow. Speech could be that we say something different. And mind would be that we think something different, right? And so one example, just in a very day-to-day way that I give in the book is that, like you might think, oh, how come I keep getting in the same pointless arguments, with my partner or with my child, right? Why? Why does this keep happening? And then the action that we could take there is to be like, well, this is a situation, and maybe I can say something different from what I usually say, right? And then that'll change the trajectory, of the relationship.
And very often different action leads to different thoughts.
Exactly, exactly. And then it's cumulative
Mm.
because then that thought leads to a different kind of thought and a different kind of thought, and then you've created a new reality for yourself that it makes you happier, which is what we all want.
Right. Sort of the
Yeah,
goal here is living a clearer life.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Dalai Lama, he often talks about how everyone has the right to be happy and that we all want to be happy.
Mhm.
And it sounds very simple, in a way you're like, yeah, of course, we all want to be happy, but actually often it's a little bit elusive, I think for us, it eludes us, or we do things that work against our happiness. And so you think, why would we do that? But the actions we take actually don't make us that happy. Maybe we work too much, or, we, we're on social media too much, or, whatever it is that makes us unhappy, but we keep doing it. And so the idea is that we can, through these actions, whether they're large or small, we can change that.
Right. Right, right. Um, Going back to the book for just a moment,
Mhm.
you frame it beautifully with the death of your grandmother. Can you tell us a little bit about her and her life and the what the Tibetan Buddhist funeral meant to you and your family? So beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. For the beginning of the book, it opens with my grandmother's traditional Tibetan funeral, which took place. She died in 2004 and in Darjeeling, and she was 100. And a traditional Tibetan funeral was held for her, and probably one of the last that'll be held, as because of the changes that have taken place. And um, she, basically, what happens is that the body is laid out in the altar room, and the lamas or the monks come to the house and they sit next to the body. In her case, there were 5 lamas sitting there, and they read from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, again to guide her right through Bardo, right? And one of the really interesting things about the Tibetan Book of the Dead is that it was composed for both the dead and the living. And when I heard that, at first I was really surprised because I thought, what does that mean? I mean, I wasn't even sure, like, what does it mean is composed for the dead, but the dead and the living. And the idea is that, for example, as we are sitting in the family members, the surviving family members are sitting in the altar room listening to the prayers, that we also can reflect on what the lamas are saying. And so, one of the things that they say, and again, this surprised me, is that they say to the dead person, "You're dead." And I thought, that's really interesting. Why do they keep saying that? They're like, "You're dead, and death comes to us all." And the idea, and my grandmother used to talk about this, is that when we die, we're usually in denial, is the belief, right? Is that and as she put it, we hover around the altar room, and we're like, we see our family and they look so sad, and we're like, hey guys, why are you crying? I'm right over here. Why do you look so sad? And then after about 4 days, and it's like 4.5 days, we're like, oh, like, that's like something, it's like, well, something's, we're like, something's going on here. And then this one chapter of my book is called Coming to Realize You're Dead. And the idea in the Bardo, from death to rebirth, is that until the dead person accepts what has happened, they can't move forward. Right. And so one of the stories that my grandmother told me, and there are many of her stories throughout the book that she told me over the years. One of the stories is that when she was 18, she rode her pony from Darjeeling to Tibet, to Lhasa. Her father was working there, and she went to spend time with him. And they went to a Tibetan funeral, which was like a sky burial. And so the body was on the ground, and the lamas were there reading from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And she said that the lamas could see that the dead person was trying to re-enter his body.
Okay.
And I said, and she said they couldn't see it because they were lay people, but the lamas could see it. And of course, and this I thought was such a fantastic story because it really stuck with me, metaphorically, that's what we often do in life. So, for example, if when, let's say, when my children leave home, right, and when my nest is empty, if I'm unable to let go of their childhood and of the life that we had together, and I cling to that, that would be an example that would be, similar to what the story that she told about the man trying to go back into his body, is that I'm trying to go back into this life. And of course, the big thing is that we can't, because it's over, right? We can't, but we still cling. And so that's why a lot of the teachings are and the ideas or the principles are really valuable to us as we go through from birth to death, right? Because the Buddha said, right, famously, that all life is suffering. And so we have, old age, sickness, death. And the interesting thing, of course, those things make us really sad, but that fundamentally, from a Buddhist perspective, what makes us most suffer is our resistance to those things, right? And so it's our resistance to change, that our struggle against change, our clinging, that makes us the most unhappy, right? And the saddest, rather than moving through the changes that come up in life, the transitional periods, and accepting them. And it doesn't mean, sometimes people think that means, oh, you're not going to be sad, you'll just be like, oh, okay, that life's over, I'm done with it. And in fact, of course we're sad, because we're human and we grieve, but it makes it so that we can grieve more fully, because we're open, we're accepting it, and we're open to it, rather than, trying to push it away, or not think about it, or cling to something that we can't have anymore.
Can you just say a little bit more about that? Like, how does a maybe you did it when your grandmother passed away with these beautiful rituals. How do we do that? How do we grieve more fully? How do we learn to be present there?
I think one way, and here I'll mention again, the Dalai Lama, he meditates every day on death. And I think sometimes people think, oh, why would you do that when you're alive? You don't want to spend your time alive, thinking about death. But what he says is that it helps him be more prepared. Will help him be more prepared when his end actually comes, as well as it helps to accept the endings that we experience in life. And so we can. I also talk in my book about Montaigne, the French philosopher, and who wrote a lot about this exact. I think he and the Dalai Lama would have been very good friends if they could meet. And he wrote about this as well, is that awareness of death allows us to live more fully, right? That we can practice death, which is kind of it's an interesting idea. And so we can practice it. And again, it doesn't have to be in these uh, you know, huge ways. Like Montaigne uses the example that there used to be an Egyptian custom where during this big feast, when everyone's eating and drinking and being merry, they would bring in a corpse
Mhm.
or a mummy or whatever it was, and to remind everyone that death is always there. It's the other part of this life that we're living. And of course, we're not probably going to experience that, and most of us are not going to experience, like, for example, what I did of sitting next to my grandmother's body for days. um, but that we can practice it in very small but really powerful ways. So for
Mhm.
example, we can notice the end of the day. And of course, we go through these endings all the time. We just don't mark them, right? Or we don't notice them. So we can be like, oh, when I'm walking home from work, I can see the twilight. I can watch the sky changing color, right? Or I can note the end of a trip, right? When I get back, or the end of a dinner. And so these are things that, or in Japan, where I live, right, in Tokyo, there are many earthquakes, as you
Yes.
know, right? From when you lived here. And there are earthquakes all the time, some small, of course, and some, most small and some larger. But that those are really good example too, where you might take a moment and go, oh, that's a reminder. That's a reminder of impermanence, or an example of impermanence, right? Where at any moment, right, things can change. And so it's a question of attention. I think it's a lot of question of attention, like paying attention. And we hear that a lot these days, like, oh, people are distracted and we're not paying attention. And I would say that we are paying attention, but the question is, what are we paying attention to? Right? Our attention is on something, right? But what are we paying attention to? And if we paid, so that's another thing that the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the lamas say all the time. And I remember when I first encountered this in my research, I thought, why do they keep saying this? And the first translation, the one that my great grandfather helped with, is in this kind of old English. And the lamas say to the dead person, they say, let not thy mind be distracted. And they say this over and over again in different ways. And I thought, why do they keep saying that? And again, the idea is that we tend to, just sort of get lost in our thoughts and projections and daydreams, and thinking about the past and thinking about the future, and not really being in the present moment. right? And that two things. One is that doesn't allow us to see that whatever our current situation is clearly. And also it means we're not living fully because we're, like our body is here. Like maybe my body is here right now, but my mind is off somewhere else, right? And so that's another aspect of it.
Right. And we can do this on a daily basis, I really think. Like, for example, we've been talking about around the example of your kids leaving for school and being an empty nester and things like that. I think we acknowledge, if I'm hearing you right, we acknowledge that it's happening or will be happening. We're better off acknowledging prior to it happening and
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
then practice the enjoyment of what we have. And then
Right.
maybe the letting go will be a little bit simpler.
I think so. I think so. And I think too that what's funny is that because we're human, is we of course we don't want to suffer. Nobody wants to suffer and we want to protect ourselves. And so we and that's too also, why we turn away from, like, if when our children leave or when somebody dies or whatever the change or the transition may be, is we want to turn away from it. And so well, to take one example, let's say that you have a bad breakup with somebody, or a divorce or whatever it is, that the tendency then is to want to protect ourselves, right? So then I might think, well, in my next relationship I'm going to hold back. I'm going to hold back because I don't want to be hurt, and I don't want to suffer. And so it can expand into any area of our life. And so where we again, it's a kind of clinging. And so we cling to what we know and we protect ourselves because we're afraid of suffering. But then of course we're not living fully, we're not, plunging fully into life.
It's sort of a lost opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about a time when you had a brush with death and how these teachings kind of helped you to embrace some of the concepts that are so central here. Can you just tell us a little bit about that time and what it meant to you and your family?
Some years ago, I got here in Tokyo, I got very, very sick. I woke up and out of the blue, I was just very ill. I was supposed to travel the next day and everything was canceled. I ended up in the hospital and I was there for 6 weeks. And it took the doctors a while to figure out what it was. But finally they realized that I had it's called endocarditis, and it's a bacterial, you have bacteria in your heart valve,
Mhm.
and it's a life-threatening disease. And it was very scary. And I was put on antibiotics, and they were hoping, that this was going to take care, cure me. And so I was put on antibiotics, and after a few days, the bacteria, what they call vegetation, had decreased a lot, like dramatically, about 40%. And so my husband and I were, ecstatic, because I'm like, that's it. I'm out of here. I was already like thinking I'm gonna like pack my bag, and I'd be discharged in the next day or two. And the only person who wasn't happy was my doctor. And he was standing there kind of frowning. And I thought maybe it's just, professional reserve, or, kind of optimism. I mean, cautious, being cautious just in case. And then he said,
Very
actually,
Japanese.
yeah, that's what I thought. I thought, oh, but then he said, well, when this happens, if it's such a dramatic reduction in the vegetation, it usually means that part of it has broken off, right? And so it doesn't mean it's gone away. It means it's broken off and it can travel through your bloodstream to another part of your body and, cause an infection there. So that indeed is what had happened. And had traveled to my brain and caused an abscess in my brain. And at that point, the doctors were it looked like I was going to either end up in a kind of vegetative state. They were going to try brain surgery, maybe, and maybe I just wasn't going to make it. And so I, I went through a lot of denial, because I thought, actually, I was like, I thought this can't be happening to me, because I'm in my 40s and I have two young children and I have a beautiful life, that I love and here. And then I went through the whole thing of like, why me? And I thought,
Mm.
oh, maybe I'll have like spontaneous remission. I thought that happens for people, right? I was like, I've heard stories of that. And then I thought, oh, well, maybe it's misdiagnosis. They could be wrong. I mean, so I went through all this. And at some point, that story of my great grandfather in the avalanche came back to me. And and partly I think it was because in my hospital room, everything was white and the curtains were always closed around my bed. So it was these white curtains and the white ceiling. And it was almost like I felt entombed, kind of like he had been in the snow. And that story came back to me, and I'd heard it many years before from my grandmother, and it's an amazing story, but I didn't really put it together in any larger way. But now it really helped me because I saw that, you know, if I accepted that I was actually like making it worse by struggling against my situation, struggling against the truth of my situation, which was not something I could change in the same way, like he couldn't change, that he was buried in this avalanche. And so, um, and it really helped me to accept what was happening, but not give up, right? Because I was really afraid. I was so afraid. I thought, oh, gosh, if I accept what's going to be happening, then I'm given, if I accept what's happening, then I've given up. Because that's what we think, right? We think that acceptance is passive, right? We just go, oh, that's it. There's nothing I can do. And what I love about this idea, in this principle, this Bardo principle, is that it actually clears the way for you to do something, right? That acceptance. It's the opposite of what we think, right? And so, um, it meant in my case, obviously, I wasn't going to jump out of bed, like it wasn't going to be right. It wasn't going to be an action of body, I wasn't going to like grab my stuff and go home. And it wasn't so much an action of speech, but it was very much one of mind for me. It changed. I really changed my perspective, and I started looking at it in a new way, which was that um, this this was a really bad situation. I thought this is really bad, and I might not make it. But I didn't feel despair when with my sort of new way of looking at it. And there are things I realized, one of the really moving ideas in Bardo is that new perspectives or new insight is available to us if we're open to it. And this different perspective opened me to seeing things in a new way. And so, for example, in Bardo, it's believed that we've lost harmony often, that we're trying to recover this harmony that we had. And so I always had thought that meant that we're trying to get back the life that we had. That was the harmony, right? And so my harmony was, having my two kids and being a university professor and, and so on. And what I realized it actually was it's the harmony in the hospital I came to see is that it's the harmony we lose when we forget that impermanence is the only certainty, right, in life. It's nothing to do with, like getting back the life you had or anything like that, but just that. And that actually made me feel better. You know what I mean? Because it's like I'm like, that's the harmony. And when we remember that, then we can be more in flow, with whatever's happening, however challenging it is.
I had an experience that when at a time when I was sick where I was kind of fighting against it and getting into a hospital and a nurse whispered to me, you control what you can control and let us do the rest
Yeah.
with for you. And it was life-changing for me in that moment because you can't control everything or a lot of things.
Right, right. And that's, and sometimes people ask me around this book, for example, people, who have read it ask me, they're like, but what about those things? What about those things that we can't control, like illness or a big earthquake or, or the kind of accident that my great grandfather had? And isn't that cause for despair, right? But the idea is that we can control how we act in the face of that. Right? So we can't change it. We can't change it as much as we'd like to, but we can change either what we do or what we say or how we see it.
And there is hope in the future, for the future. Even
Right.
period of despair or illness, it is not permanent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And one of the ideas for my grandmother, for example, as she was going through Bardo, the Tibetan belief, after she died, is that she encounters obstacles.
Okay.
And when she died, and I went to Darjeeling for the funeral, there was a special ceremony that was held for me and some of the other relatives. That's called, it's basically an obstacle removing ceremony, right? Because the idea is that the surviving relatives will also encounter obstacles, right? When somebody dies. And so there was a ceremony and there were prayers and prayer flags and so on, and it was all very lovely, but I wasn't sure, what exactly it was about or what would happen and so on. And then 6 years later is when I got sick. And after I got well and I got out of the hospital, I was discharged. And I remember thinking about that ceremony. And again, I love this thing where like it's one of the part of the legend of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is that when it was composed in the 8th century by Padmasambhava, by Guru Rinpoche, it was what is called a treasure teaching, one of his treasure teachings. And what he did, according to legend, is hide them to be discovered by future generations when they most needed them. And I really love that idea because that is what I feel happened to me, for example, with the story of my great-grandfather in the avalanche, is that when I needed it most, this story came back to me, kind of, from my family's mind stream, if you will. And then the same thing with this obstacle removing ceremony is I realized after I'd been discharged is I thought like in the Bardo of illness, when I was in the hospital, I thought my obstacle was the illness. Right. Because I'm like, here I am, like, I'm like up against it, encountering obstacles here. First, the, bacteria in my heart valve, and then that it went to my brain and all. And then what I realized is that those were not the obstacles. Right? And that in fact, the obstacle had been my own struggling against it. And that's what had caused me the most suffering.
I think people today call that getting in your own way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so those were some of the things and that's one of the things I really love too, is it's very, a lot of these ideas are very applicable,
Right.
to our day-to-day lives, whether it's something like, extraordinary, like the illness I had or the one that you had, or even just, day-to-day stuff like things at work or things that, in relationships or, but that's what our lives are made of.
I mean, it's okay to have just a bad day occasionally, right? I mean, it just happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's okay to have a bad day. And because I think sometimes we think, oh, we shouldn't have it. You think, oh, like I shouldn't have any bad days, once I've like reached this kind of, enlightened view of things. Right. But I think the really enlightened view would be like, there are some bad days, and that's okay, rather than or you're like, sometimes we're in a bad mood or something like, or right. That's right. It just happens. And that's like, um, that's accepting that is what it is. Like sometimes, I worry, for example, as we all do, and I worry and I'm like, of course, what good does that do? And so on. And sometimes I just can't stop for the moment. And so then I just think, well, I'm just going to worry right now. And so it's part of that whole, what makes us human.
Right. You can enjoy that afterward, maybe.
Afterward. Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope that this isn't too bold of a question, but when you were writing, and I've when I was reading your book, and I've read many things that you've written in the past too, I could actually see the vista of the Himalayas, and I could kind of see it coming off the page. And you talk about the mama sun sweeping the streets in Tokyo, and all this beautiful imagery. Some of it that I've seen before, of course, but so vivid, so beautiful. I encourage everybody to get the book. But do you write every day? What are you working on now, if you don't mind me
Oh,
asking?
yeah. I do write every day. And I teach full time at university, and so it's not always like I have these big chunks of time
Sure.
to write. But I remember reading an interview some years ago with a writer who said that she, even if she has a really, really busy day, she always gets even just half an hour at the keyboard. And that
That's
really stuck with me. Yeah. And so I do that, right? Really, even if it's just half an hour or 45 minutes or whatever it is. And part of the reason for that is, of course, that I love it, but also that it keeps it going in your consciousness and subconscious, right? Whereas if I don't work on it at all and I just leave it for a week because I'm busy, then you come back and it's kind of cold, right? But this keeps, and then if I do this even a little bit every day, of course, sometimes I'll work like 10 hours a day, or sometimes it'll be half an hour.
Mm.
Um, I'll find that I dream about it, or that when I'm running, for example, some other maybe difficult part that I wasn't sure about will be solved. And so I really love that, how that your mind still is working on it, even if when you're doing other things.
Right. Sometimes your best ideas appear in the shower.
That's right. That's right. Or when you're cooking or when you're worrying, right? So who
Right.
knows, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And now I'm working on a new book, and then um and I'm always working on, I do these as Kate mentioned in the introduction, interviews about impermanence for Tricycle Magazine with writers like George Saunders or Ann Patchett. And then I write essays as well. So always something. There's always
Joyce,
something. Yeah. I
there's
mean,
always
if we have time, I don't know if we do, but I would love to just read a short section from the beginning of the book just to give a sense of what you're talking about here. You were saying the kind of Himalayas coming off the page
I would
and what
love that.
that
I think
environment. Shall I
everybody.
do that? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
All
I think
right.
everybody would love
All
it.
right. So
Mhm.
here's the book. And this is the beginning of um, from chapter one, which is, as I mentioned, about my grandmother's funeral.
I just want to mention before you begin, Anne, that
Yeah.
you read, perhaps we'll take some questions. So if people want to put that
Mm,
in the chat, I will be happy to moderate those.
wonderful. Okay. On a winter afternoon in 2004, I landed at a tiny airport north of Calcutta and began the sad journey into the Himalayas for my grandmother's funeral. The taxi driver sped up the winding road that I had first traveled over 40 years earlier on my mother's lap, when I was a small girl and visiting Darjeeling with my parents. Now I gazed out at the familiar tea gardens and villages, the dense forests of bamboo and palms and wild orchids. Soon the car was enveloped in swirling mist, all coming and going as in dream time. A wizened man standing outside a cottage holding a sickle, monkeys scampering by the roadside, prayer flags fluttering over a gorge, 4 llamas walking single file down a dirt path, their robes vermilion in the gloom. I reached Darjeeling at twilight as the snowy peaks of Mount Kanchenjunga were vanishing into the blue like great ships setting sail. Along the road, shoppers thronged the market stalls, buying live chickens, vegetables, spices, snacks, and sundries. A barefoot boy hawked bracelets, crying out in a high sing-song voice. As we passed the railway station and made the hairpin turn into my grandmother's lane, I felt afraid, because for the first time my grandmother wouldn't be waiting for me at the door to her little house. When I had come to see her over the years, I had always arrived late in the day, and she was ready with cucumber sandwiches and freshly brewed Darjeeling tea. But now, instead, there would be tea for the people streaming in to pay their respects. I started up the polished wooden stairs to the second floor, the same stairs my mother used to take two at a time after school, hungry for the momo dumplings and fried flour jalebis my grandmother would put out in the dining room. The stairs that my mother carried me up when I was a little girl, that I climbed when I lived with my grandmother after college, and that my own children bounded up when we came for visits. The same stairs my grandmother's body would be brought down in a few days, when the death ceremonies were finished and she left her house for the very last time. My mother had already arrived from her home in California and was on the landing greeting condolence callers. She was the grand old lady of Darjeeling, people were saying, a legend. No one will replace her. It's the end of an era. I walked with my mother along the hall to the altar room where the prayers for my grandmother were underway. In the glow of butter lamps burning on the old altar carved with the Tibetan lucky symbols, 5 red-robed lamas sat next to my grandmother's body, which lay on cushions under a mound of white kata blessing scarves. In low, incantatory voices, the lamas were reading from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, encouraging my grandmother to move forward without fear in the Bardo between death and rebirth.
Wow.
So that's the opening of the first chapter.
Really, it's just, again, the imagery is so evocative and beautiful.
Thank you.
I see it. And what's a butter lamp?
A butter lamp is it's like a, what do I have one? I think I have one right here, but it's like it's a small, it can be like silver or wooden, but it has butter in it, and then it's like a candle. It looks like a candle, and so you light that, and then it burns.
Mhm.
So those, and then in the altar room, they're usually you light them along with incense and offer them.
Beautiful. Really, really beautiful.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Again, if you want to put some questions in the chat, we do have one so far from Anne McNeish. Is your book meant to be a novice's non-Buddhist guide to the teachings of the of the Dead?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it can be. I like to think of it as, as I mentioned, my great grandfather helped to bring this to the West, and it was published in 1927, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And now we're not too far away from the 100th anniversary of that, right? So next year, right?
Mhm.
And I like to think that in my, in whatever way I can, that I'm carrying forward the work that he did and that mattered so much to him. And maybe perhaps my book is a kind of, you know, I mean, it's memoir, it's family history, it's Buddhist philosophy, but it also very much carries forward the teachings, of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so I think it can be a kind of guide to the teachings in the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Right. It sort of, it really does bring it to a level where we can understand.
Yeah, because the actual Tibetan Book of the Dead is not that easy to to understand. I don't know if you tried to read it, but it's like, yeah, it's whereas I hope that this will also make it more accessible for people.
Yeah, good. Are there any other questions from anyone or no? Was there something you wanted to include in the book that you ended up having to leave out from Jane?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Not that immediately comes to mind. I mean, as you know, as a writer, you're always putting out to now, and I probably have a book about this length of what was taken out. So that can be like the other book but I don't feel like there was anything that I wanted to include that I had to leave out. It wasn't, and it's not like the book was too long and I had to cut parts of it or anything like that. So,
Mm,
um, I not no, I don't really I didn't have that experience.
that's great. That's great because it does feel very organically uh, inclusive.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Amy as well, 'cause as a writer, that um things kind of books or something, whether it's an essay or a book, takes on a kind of life and logic of its own. And so you like things that I thought like that I would put in, sometimes you know how they just can't be in there. It's like, you know, it's almost like the manuscript rejects it or something. It just doesn't fit, even though it seems like it should, right? Exactly. Or sometimes that happens if you're working on a novel and you have characters and you want them to say this thing and they just won't say it, you know. It's like, and so there was that experience sometimes where things that I really thought would fit, either stories or ideas that I had, didn't fit, but it wasn't that I wanted them so much in there, but just that there are things that I thought would go in there. And then I realized, you know, when I was writing it, that they would have to go into some other thing, that some kind of future work.
It will. It will. That's why we
Yeah,
save
yeah,
this.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Sophia is asking, based on the definition of Bardo, it seems that we're always in Bardo. Are there times when we're not?
Basically, we are always in Bardo. If you think, because from birth to death is Bardo. And so we're always in it. We're always in a period of transition, and I don't think you could, you know, you could say, well, we're not always, of course, we're not always, thank goodness, we're not always in crisis. You know, we're like having these you know, the momentous things happen all the time, you know, that happen to us in life. But we are always in Bardo in the larger sense of from birth to death, where we, if we think of it in terms of what I mentioned earlier about Bardo being a time of great possibility, and this is, to my mind, one of the really moving things about the Bardo idea is that as human beings, we have the possibility always of new insight, right? As we go through from birth to death. And there's a Buddhist story, you know, about like how lucky we are, how fortunate we are to be born human, right? Is what they say. And the chance of being born human is the same as the chance of a tortoise who comes to the surface of the ocean once every 100 years, putting his head through a golden yolk floating on the waves there. And so the point being, of course, that we're extremely lucky to be born human. And so um, not to waste time, you know, not to waste time, and to really make the most of our lives. And that is the larger idea of I think of always being in Bardo.
I think about things like that when I'm teaching and my class is finishing, and I often ask students, so what was the good and what was the not so good? And
Mm-hmm.
I teach these research and inquiry classes, and I have the opportunity to improve or try something new the following semester with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, right. And so it's really it's an ongoing process. And it's not, sometimes people ask me if Bardo is linear, right? You're like, you know, so it's like first this and then this and then this, right? And I don't think, I think of it more as like this. It kind of expands, you know, this way. It's not like this, like we're like, and that it's a matter of deepening our experience of life, whether
Mhm.
we are we're, you know, feel like we're in transition, or we're actually in transition, or just, you know, um one of the things that going back to your question about the rituals at my grandmother's funeral and what how that impacted me, or what I took away from that, is that when her after the prayers were finished in the house, what happens is the body is taken to the cremation ground.
Mhm.
So there was a funeral procession and her body was taken to the cremation ground. And what really surprised me is that so there was a coffin, and the coffin was put on the funeral pyre, and the family members, like me and my mother, were asked to light the pyre. Right? And I was surprised because I thought it would be one of the lamas or something, but we did. And the idea there, and again, this is something my grandmother used to tell me, is that that's a really good example of one of the lessons for us, the living, right? Because we look at, you know, when we might look at a dead person, or, you know, my grandmother in the altar room, and you might think, well, you know, thank goodness uh, that's not me, right?
Mhm.
We think, right? But the idea is it's going to be us. And so, and we might think, oh, that's really dark, and I don't want to think about that. But again, the idea is that then that encourages us to do now, right? To live our lives now and to live as fully as we can.
Mhm.
Because we think we're immortal.
We do.
We do. I mean, or we live as if we're immortal, right? We have all the time in the world and we procrastinate. And we're like, oh, I'll move to Rome tomorrow, or I'll ask her to marry me next week, or whatever it is. But we don't, we're not, and so the idea is to live now.
Mhm. Right, right. Um, we have a question. We have a couple more questions. This one from Marilyn. Ms. Slater, you are a serious, if not professional mind spirit practitioner. You are also a runner, a more body-mind connection. How can you reconcile that? Or is it sort of the same?
It feels like much of a muchness to me. I would say that mind, spirit, or body, mind. Yeah, it all for me kind of comes. It doesn't blend together, but it intertwines, right, in a way that feels organic or connected to me.
Mhm. Yeah. And Kara is asking, because Bardo is birth to death, is there an understanding or concept of what happens before birth or after death? Are they believed to be the same place or plane?
I guess, so Bardo is birth to death, and then it's death to rebirth. So it's kind of a continuum,
Mhm.
right? And the idea in the Tibetan belief, right, is that maybe you take rebirth, right? And hopefully you have a good rebirth, right? And you come back. So my grandmother, for example, was very conscious of karma, right? And karma is a really big idea in what's for her and in the Tibetan belief in Bardo, right? Is that what the actions that we take in this life will influence what kind of life our next one is, right? And that going back to what you were saying, Amy, before, is, about how if we have a new thought, we think about something in a new way, an action, right? Then that influences our next action because now we're thinking in a different way. Therefore, we're going to do something different.
Mhm.
So it can be in that sort of day-to-day way for us between birth and death. And it can also be in the way of like from this life to the, after death Bardo and then to rebirth. And then the idea too is that if we, if all goes well, we actually will not go on to life after life after life, right? In the sense of samsara. Samsara means like the cycle of suffering. And again, the way I talk about it in the book is metaphorically, is that it's the same thing. Like if we, to take a simple example, like in this Bardo, if we between birth and death, if we keep doing the same thing over and over that makes us unhappy, we're just going to keep cycling, back into it. And so metaphorically, we can sort of look at it that way. And so whether or not one believes that, you go on to rebirth, or believes in reincarnation, certainly the idea is that we're experiencing that same kind of thing by the choices that we make, in this Bardo. And so are they believed to be the same place or plane? I would say no. They're not believed to be the same. They're different, right? In the Tibetan belief, are they? But the principles are very applicable if we think of, there are many Bardos, but let's say the larger, birth to death and death to rebirth. So in that sense, they're similar.
I really appreciate you explaining all of these terms and the book itself and how it expands upon the language of the Tibetan theology, if you will, and accessible to people who have not been exposed to it before.
Yeah.
So, and I can't tell you how much fun it is always to talk to you. And
It's been a real pleasure, and I really appreciate all these wonderful questions and everybody's joining us today. And it's really, I've enjoyed this conversation a lot.